This is a fairly straightforward chapter. Chapter 13 covers the results and the discussion section of your research paper. A reminder that similar to the chapters on conducting analyses, both quantitative as well as qualitative, the focus for this chapter is to make sure that you understand the logic underlying this part of the research model. You won't have to actually do this section in your proposal because, of course, you aren't actually conducting research, collecting data. This is kind of just a straightforward discussion of, what these sections would look like organizationally if you were writing a research paper. And so I'm just providing this information so that you can understand what to look for maybe when you read others' research articles, like you should be doing for your literature review section. But this isn't actually a section that is going to be in your own proposal, so you don't have to worry about writing one or emulating the steps that are discussed in the chapter. So we have made our way around our research model. We are really in the final two steps, the analyzing the results and the sharing the results. One way, of course, of sharing results is through research articles, which is what we've kind of been discussing in terms of, how do you build a research article? What type of information do you put in it? And we'll talk a little bit more explicitly about how do you share, disseminate, present your research in the upcoming chapter, chapter 14, as well. But for this particular chapter, the focus is really on, how do you structure that results section and discussion section of the paper. So before we get into the textbook material, one thing that I just want to emphasize at the outset of this chapter is that, especially when you're talking about sociology and social science, where you're studying humans and human behavior and interactions, there's rarely only one interpretation. And you'll see that when we're discussing the discussion section, that the textbook authors mention how this is your opportunity to offer the interpretation, your own interpretation of your findings. And sometimes that raises red flags or concerns for students. But that is just true because there are so many possible motivating factors for human behavior and interactions. There is rarely only one interpretation, and sometimes there is not even a clear right interpretation. As the book discusses, you use your own experiences, you use how a topic or a phenomena is kind of addressed within your discipline or within larger society to kind of shape the interpretations that you offer. But this doesn't mean that interpretation is the same as opinion, because unlike opinion, your interpretation is still bound by the empirical evidence that you gathered and analyzed. Just because there isn't always a clear right or wrong interpretation doesn't mean necessarily that you can say anything or that anything goes. And I think that's really important to note. Not so much right now because you are going to be writing a discussion section in my class, because as I've already stated, you will not, but because when you are reading your own research articles for your proposal, for your assignments, I don't want you to just swallow, without question every single thing that the authors, state. They are presenting their interpretation and they are presenting it, with authoritative, force and conviction, because part of it is they are trying to get you, the reader, to share their interpretation, to see the phenomena and their findings about that phenomena the way that they see it. But I want you to learn how to be a critical reader. And you learn how to be a critical reader by learning how to read academic research with mindful skepticism, mindful that the fact that human behavior is very complicated, and it's not the same thing as conducting like a chemistry experiment in a lab. So there are always going to be limitations. There's always going to be ways in which the research can be improved upon or advanced. There should always be questions that you have about the research once you have finished reading the article. And I don't want you to just necessarily accept the author's interpretations at face value, but to ask yourself critical questions, to be an active reader. This isn't the same thing as stubborn resistance, because I am not encouraging that, and I very much strongly suggest you do not engage in that. That is a sign of willful ignorance. And so what I mean by stubborn resistance is you treat empirical evidence as if it was just opinion. You look at the breadth of the collected evidence, and instead of accepting kind of what does social science reveal about this topic, you reject that. You reject science. Being a mindful skeptic isn't doing that either. So, before I get into the textbook material, I just wanted to kind of make this clear, to make this plain, right? That while findings can be open to interpretation, there are limits and bounds, right? You can't just make the data say, what you want it to say. But at the same time, because there are oftentimes multiple interpretations, when you are reading the discussion section of research articles, I do want you to practice that active engagement, that critical reading, be a mindful skeptic, and ask important questions about the study, the methods that it was based upon, the findings that it yielded, and the interpretations that the authors are offering you. So as the textbook states, the results section is the most straightforward of the paper. It's the complete report of your findings, and it tends to follow a basic structure. First you present your demographics, and then you go into your findings, usually beginning with the more simple univariate analyses, and then moving up to your bivariate, multivariate analyses. So that demographic section, what it usually consists of is, of course, you identify the number of participants that you had in your study, and then you talk about the basic characteristics of that population, your gender, your race, ethnicity, age, marital status, education, religious affiliation, your, whatever demographic characteristics were meaningful for your study. And they were probably meaningful because you noted that people use them in the literature as common control variables. And so you talk about this information usually in the form of percentages, not raw numbers, because that helps your readers get a better sense of their significance. And that really is the goal of this section, is you want to familiarize your readers with your study. After the demographic section comes your findings. Researchers typically provide general information about the key variables within the population. So for your independent, your dependent variables, what were the frequencies, the averages, the percentages, in regards to those variables. After that initial information is provided, then you continue with findings related to the relationships between two or more of those variables. If you're doing quantitative research, this is usually in the form of more advanced analyses, which we lightly touched on some of that in a previous chapter, your correlation and regression techniques. The findings section concludes with the discussion of the hypotheses, if you have hypotheses, if you were conducting quantitative research, or with the narrative discussing the relationship and the patterns that you noted in your population. And that's if you were doing qualitative research. And so, I have emphasized this several times that, certain types of research involve certain types of methodology, and then what you actually do in the process of setting up that study, it can slightly differ. So we've gone over the distinction between inductive and deductive multiple times, and we should know by now that deductive is usually associated with quantitative methodology, and inductive is more more likely going to be qualitative methodology. And another key distinction is that with deductive research, you are formulating a hypothesis. Actually, two. You have your alternative hypothesis, and you can have multiple of those, and you have your null hypothesis. And then you don't have hypotheses when you are doing inductive research. Instead, you're asking an open-ended question. So for those quantitative studies that involve testing one or more hypotheses, you're basically offering some type of prediction. That's what your alternative hypothesis is. And that prediction is dependent on what you read in the literature, what your theoretical framework that you're using, what it suggests should occur. And you formulate these hypotheses, your alternative, and then your null hypothesis, of course, just states that there's no relationship at all between your primary variables. And so then once you collect your data and you run your analyses, you can then address the accuracy of your prediction. And the textbook talks about how you do this in terms of either, rejecting the null hypothesis or failing to reject the null hypothesis. So rejecting the null hypothesis means that there is some relationship between your variables. Now, just because you rejected the null doesn't necessarily mean you have proven the alternative hypothesis. It somewhat is dependent upon, what type of alternative hypothesis, did you have? Did you have a directional hypothesis? Or did you have a non-directional hypothesis? Because if you had a directional hypothesis, then perhaps the relationship isn't existing in the direction that you predicted that it would, in which case, just because you rejected the null does not necessarily mean that your alternative hypothesis was shown to be true. Now, what happens if your research suggests that, in fact, there is no relationship between the primary variables? Well, now what you have is a failure to reject the null hypothesis, and that's how you state it. It's not a failure to prove the alternative hypothesis, and it's not an acceptance of the null hypothesis. It is a failure to reject the null hypothesis. Now, of course, when you're collecting data, you're hoping to find a relationship, right? You're hoping that a relationship exists between your variables, that your prediction is shown to be true. But that is not always the case. And although this type of research is maybe less likely to be greeted with, big headlines and a primary placement in an important academic journal, as your textbook notes, just because you fail to reject the null hypothesis doesn't mean that still isn't a contribution to the advancement of science as well, right? We still learn something. We still have determined some kind of variation on our phenomena, under what types of circumstances does this relationship not exist? It perhaps sheds light on a specific population, or the specific use of a measure or a type of method. The idea here being is, I don't want you to see that word failure to reject the null hypothesis and associate it with that typical connotation around the word failure. You still contributed to the scientific progress around your given phenomena, even if your prediction, in fact, does not turn out to be true. So what about qualitative studies? Well, in terms of qualitative research and what that results section looks like, it oftentimes follows a pretty similar format, at least at the outset. They provide an overview of demographics. And sometimes in a qualitative study, this might be the only numbers you see, right? They still will tell you the number of participants, in their study. They still will provide some type of breakdown, usually in the percentage format of, important demographic characteristics like race or sex or education. And then in terms of findings, once you move past demographics, findings for qualitative studies are usually focused on pointing out patterns of similarity and differences that were recognized during the qualitative analysis. And so how they present these patterns, your book goes into detail. Oftentimes this is up to the researcher, the author, but they're trying to present the patterns in such a way that it makes it clear which patterns were more significant, and then also just kind of the role of organizational logic. Sometimes some patterns only make sense in light of some more primary initial patterns that were determined. Qualitative studies add depth by providing rich detail. They often do this by making use of direct quotes and comments from the participants. So when you're reading that results section, it reads more like a narrative outside of the quantitative statistics used to discuss the demographic composition of their sample. You usually don't see a lot of other numbers beyond that. That being said, like quantitative research, qualitative research can also make use of visual tools like charts and graphs. They make use of diagrams and figures with that same goal of conveying information to readers. And so this chapter does add a little bit more information about the importance of visual elements when presenting your results. They talk about visual representations help convey meaning. They show the dynamics. They depict details. They illuminate key relationships. And so you're making a decision about what visuals you need, because any visuals that you include in your paper, they really need to have a clear purpose. And so this chapter highlights two in particular. It goes over the function and purpose of tables. And then it discusses an additional type of figure, a path diagram, while also alluding to other types of figures, pie graphs, line graphs, bar graphs, and of course, those were discussed in chapter 10. But a path diagram is meant to emphasize kind of the relationships that exist between different variables within your model. And then it oftentimes provides, as you can kind of see in the picture, it provides a sense of the strength of the relationship between those variables as well as the direction. So, a negative lets you know it's a negative relationship, a positive lets you know it's a positive relationship, and it's going to vary from 0 to 1. So, the higher it is, the stronger the relationship. So the relationship between amount of exercise and food intake, a pretty weak relationship. But the relationship between food intake and weight loss is at negative 0.44 is a little stronger. So then your chapter moves to the next section that comes after findings, and this is the discussion section, which they note is the most creative part of the research paper. And that's because it requires you to interweave in information from other sections, and it also is creative in the sense that this is where you offer your own interpretation of the study to the readers. The findings is a very kind of cut and dry kind of, this is what my analyses, this is what my analyses uncovered. But the discussion section is where you really kind of get to flex your creative muscle and highlight for your readers, what is significant about these analyses, how do they relate to previous literature in your theoretical model. This is where you really can kind of shape the opinion and the ideas that your reader has about your research is in this section. And so this section, because it does so much, it does need to be clear, it does need to be organized. And so this does require a certain amount of skill. I will come back to that last point, but I just kind of want to briefly to touch on the fact that you're in Research Workshop 13.2, your textbook offers kind of two popular ways in which people organize discussion sections. And you can kind of see, it kind of depends on how they want to address limitations, which we'll talk about in a second, whether or not it wants to talk about findings individually, or does it want to talk about findings collectively, because that kind of shapes how you then address how do you link it to previous research that was discussed in your literature review. So the big thing here is, of course, you just want to make sure that this is organized. Before we address limitations, a point that your book makes, and this is a point that I think I kind of started this video off with, is, although you are offering your individual interpretation, you are bound to some restrictions. You're bound to, whatever actual findings you have, right? If the findings reveal X, you just can't, claim opposite. But there also might be some restrictions about how you interpret and how you approach specific findings that come from your field of study. How does your discipline normally talk about this phenomena? How has it historically approached this type of finding, this type of relationship? And you might have restrictions that come from larger society and culture, because of course, for a lot of things in society, once again, this is what makes studying human society so interesting, but also convoluted. A lot of these I had to take a pause there. My dog was going crazy in the background. But I recall where I stopped, that part of these restrictions can come from larger society and culture, because a lot of measures are social constructs, and their definitions and connotations within society can change over time. And so that might be impacting the interpretation that you offer as well. Okay, had a little bit of technological difficulty. I apologize in advance for the quality of this video. But to finish, uh, your textbook also discusses that limitations of the study need to be identified and addressed. And although there are differences in terms of where people do this in the discussion, some do it at the beginning, some do it at the end, some make this a entirely separate section of the paper before they even begin to discuss the findings. I think really the important part here is less where you offer your limitations and more that you do in fact offer your limitations. Because limitations kind of serve as a disclaimer. This is where you highlight the fact that things perhaps could have been done differently in order to increase the validity and reliability of the study. It is not a sign that a study is a bad study, that it has limitations. Researchers always have some limitations, because time, money, other resources are just, they're not unlimited. And so that introduces a certain amount of limitations. And then sometimes you become aware of measurement errors and those types of issues, once your study has already commenced or concluded, which means that you can't just easily go back and fix them and address them, and that's okay. But the key thing is you do have to acknowledge those limitations somewhere in your paper. We've already discussed, the two ways of organizing a discussion that your textbook goes over, which brings us to kind of the final part of this chapter, which is recommendations. Because usually at the end of the discussion section, most researchers will offer recommendations as to how the study can be followed up with other studies. And it's a forward-thinking process that asks, if I were to conduct an additional study on the same topic, what would be the best approach? how would I follow up with these findings? Now, sometimes that's because, in fact, the researcher will follow up with this study and on these findings, and they will do additional study on this topic. But sometimes it's them just kind of offering, some ideas about how to expand upon their study to other researchers, to people reading their work, to other people interested in the same phenomena. There are two common types of recommendations that people offer. These aren't mutually exclusive, meaning, it's not like you can only do one or the other. You obviously can do one or the other or both. One is recommendations on methodology. So this is where you maybe offer a recommendation to use a different method or to use a different measurement tool, or, to maybe do the same method and measurement tool, but with a different population. And then the other type of recommendation is a recommendation on topic. So, maybe in order to understand this phenomena better, there needs to be some other phenomena that is related to it that needs closer study. So, offering recommendations is really just how we keep this research model, this continuous kind of flow of knowledge going in science, right? It's the idea that we're learning from one another, and then we're building upon what other people have done in order to learn more. And so that is why, if you go back to that first slide, which I won't do, but I encourage you to do, when you look at that 8-step research model, this is why we put it, in the shape of a circle, as opposed to a straight line, because it is the idea, it is cyclical, and that people's research inspires other people's research. And so that is it for chapter 13.